Shalom, everyone. Hi. My name is Amos Nadan. I'm the director of the Moshe Dayan Center from Tel Aviv University. And today I'm a bit afraid because one of the people from our board, in fact, is going to guide this panel, and his name is Michael Lewis. So he is my director. Anyway, Michael is the son, as you probably know, of Bernard Lewis, is on our board, is also later on we'll have, there is, after that meeting, there is the prize in name of Bernard Lewis, and this specific panel is dedicated to Bernard Lewis, who was a great supporter for the Dayan Center, and his son, Michael, continues and in fact, a great supporter as well. So, Michael, lead us, please.
Thank you. Welcome to this afternoon's panel. It's the October 7th War and Open Source Research, what we knew and what we didn't. So I'm very grateful to be here today to chair this panel, especially grateful to Amos for inviting me. My father had this lengthy relationship with Tel Aviv dating back to the early 70s. So for almost 50 years, he was coming to Israel every year, doing some teaching at Tel Aviv University and spending about 3 months each year. And my father's ties to Israel and Zionism actually dated before World War II, and he visited Tel Aviv in the late 1930s when it was still mandatory Palestine. And he had very deep relationships with various people at Tel Aviv University, including, of course, Itamar Rabinovich. Martin Kramer was his graduate student. And then my father gave most of his library books, of academic books, to Tel Aviv. And over the years, my father's attachment to Israel grew ever closer, as I noted last year. This was Tel Aviv, and Israel was the place he felt was his spiritual home. And of course, he's buried in Tel Aviv. My own personal career, it was non-academic. I spent almost 40 years at AIPAC, with my focus on Israel's detractors in the United States. Now, I left AIPAC last year, so now I'm primarily on Substack and X, Twitter, and I post as Washington Views in case you want to view. I was at Tel Aviv University my freshman year, as was my future wife, Jessica. We spent our freshman year at Tel Aviv University's overseas program almost 50 years ago, 1977. And actually, it's 50 years to the very day since I first met my wife on the kibbutz, Kfar Blum. She was arriving. I was already on the kibbutz. So since my father was a historian, I just note that today's the anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. In a couple of days, it's the 30th anniversary of Yitzhak Rabin's assassination. November 10th is the 50th anniversary of the UN Zionism is Racism resolution. And other events in November, Sadat's visit to Jerusalem in 1977. November 29th is, of course, the partition vote. 1956, the Sinai campaign. 1978, the Iran hostage. Okay, so I'm going to introduce each panelist in turn. Each one, in theory, is going to talk from between 7 to 10 minutes. Then I'll ask each one of them one question after each one has spoken. And then we're going to invite questions from the audience, in which case you're going to speak into the microphones over there and there, because it's being recorded. So, the very first person to speak on this panel of open source intelligence in the October 7th attack on Israel, the Gaza war, is Jonathan Franco, postdoctoral researcher at the Moshe Dayan Center. And his title is Israeli Misconceptions, Open Source Security Intelligence, and the October 7th Attack. Thank you, Dr. Franco.
Hello, pleasure to be here. So as you already said, my title is Israeli Misconceptions, OSINT, and the 7 October Attack. So before we begin this panel, which talks a lot about OSINT, we should say what OSINT is. OSINT is essentially a short for open source intelligence. basically that information that we can all access, sometimes even from the comfort of our homes. You know that a lot of intelligence agencies, they have these high-end fancy tools, right? They have cyber operations and spy networks, whereas OSINT is, this accessible information like television, newspapers, social media, websites. And essentially now, Professor Nadan, head of the center, and myself, we co-edit an edited volume, and some of the panelists here are actually contributors to this edited volume, which deals with the 7 October attack, its surprise in Israel, the Israeli surprise of the attack, and of a lot of events that came after the attack. So, for example, the fall of the Assad regime, which surprised many, with a particular focus on OSINT and the way it was underused or misused or misconstrued. And Amos is going to talk a little bit about the findings of the edited volume as a whole. I'm going to talk a little bit about my article, which I also elaborated into a paper for this conference that compares the Israeli misconception of its enemies in 73 and 23. So the surprise with, the Egyptian-Syrian surprise of Yom Kippur and the Hamas surprise of 7 October. So in both cases, we see that the backdrop to the Israeli misconception is, of course, overconfidence. I'm sure at least most of you are familiar with the 73 case. Prior to that war, we had the 67 war, the Six-Day War, which was, to this day, probably one of Israel's most significant military victory, which convinced Israeli decision-makers and intelligence evaluators that Israel was so strong, that the Arabs wouldn't dare, quote-unquote, to attack Israel, not for at least quite a while. Of course, this assumption crumbled when Egypt and Syria launched their surprise attack in 73. In 2023, we also see a case of Israeli overconfidence before the attack. So on the geopolitical side of things, we have the Abraham Accords under the very enthusiastic brokerage of the Trump administration, the first Trump administration. We see many new Arab countries normalizing relations with Israel. And the general sentiment is that Israel is finally fitting into the Middle East. At the same time, on the military side of things, we see how in Gaza there are several military operations carried out by Israel between 2021 and 2023. And those operations are not only deemed by Israeli evaluators as successful, they are also met with relative Hamas passivity, which is interpreted in Israel as, Hamas is deterred, Hamas is caving in, when in fact we know in hindsight that Hamas was lulling Israel into a sense of false security so that it could later surprise it with a surprise attack. So this overconfidence is, in both cases, is translated in this notion that the enemy is deterred. Right? We see it with Egypt and Syria in 73. We see it with Hamas now. I gave you just three quotes from notable Israelis, but really I could give you a whole list of decision makers and evaluators who express this sentiment. So here's an example from January 2023. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says, "The quiet on our border with the Gaza Strip is a direct result of the establishment of deterrence." Defense Minister Yoav Gallant says in March 2023, "Hamas's means of actions are increasingly blocked. It is in a state of weakness." And Israeli military intelligence, the Israeli military intelligence is called in Hebrew Aman. So Aman's head, Aaron Haliva, predicts in 21 no less than 5 years of quiet on the southern front. And in September 2022, he says, "I still stand behind this assertion." So you see this confidence, very similar to the 73 era where, the enemy is deterred. We're fine. And looking back on the misconception after the 7 October attack, the man who was Israel's chief of staff, Herzi Halevi, said, "We convinced ourselves a major attack on us would not happen." And this is a very interesting quote by, again, Aman's head, Aaron Haliva, when he tried to explain where this misconception came from. He says, "It was not a matter of being smug and arrogant. It was deeper than that. There is a years-long responsibility here of organizational culture, of a perception that says, we are the state of Israel. We have a very powerful intelligence. We have everything. Our enemy is deterred. If any of you looked into the 73 case, this is remarkably similar. And I guess this is what we mean when we say history repeats itself. Now, to understand why this happened, we need to say something about the way Israeli intelligence functioned before the 7 October attack. So, cyber operations, signal intelligence, these technologies of intelligence gathering, they gain prominence, and they seem to be the future of intelligence, the next step, the future. Whereas OSINT, as several other aspects of intelligence gathering, were seen as obsolete, irrelevant. If someone in Hamas says something, it's lip service. It's not real. Or, we need to distinguish between what they say and what they do, this sort of belief. And it was so far, into this idea that in 2021, Chatzav is being shut down. Chatzav is the Amman unit responsible for collecting, monitoring, analyzing, and circulating OSINT. They basically just shut down the unit that does OSINT. And the formal argument was, we don't need a central unit to do OSINT. It's better if the different intelligence units, they each do their own little OSINT gathering, which, in effect, it made us miss a lot of very important things that Hamas was doing, and also kind of eroded the discipline of OSINT and the way to understand it and collect it in Israel. Tom Sharon here actually wrote a very interesting piece on the discipline of OSINT in our edited volume, which we will hopefully soon release. I want to give you two examples of OSINT cases of things that made it to media, but were not adequately addressed in Israel. And maybe if Chatzav was still around or something like Chatzav, we could have seen it better. So in 2021, September, in Gaza, there is a conference called the Promise of the End of Days Conference. It's held under the auspices of Hamas's Gaza leader, Yahel Sinwar. And this conference basically discusses what we do on the day after Israel is annihilated, how we administer, historical Palestine, what we do with all the Jews that are going to be left after we destroy Israel, etc. And Sinwar sends the attendees a message that basically says, our victory is close. This didn't get a lot of it, not enough, let's say, attention in Israel as it should have. In December 2022, we have Hamas's 35th anniversary, where Sinwar speaks. And Sinwar threatened there that if Israel, at the time Hamas had 4 Israeli hostages at its disposal, and he said if Israel does not release the Palestinian prisoners in exchange to these 4, we're going to have to find another way to release Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons. And, and we, and basically we'll find another way to do that. To release them. And these things were not properly addressed. Now, I want to close with just, I'm sorry if I'm a bit over, but I promise it's not going to be long. I just want to close by saying some academics did point out that Hamas is not deterred, okay? Unfortunately, I was not one of them, but we have a few of them in our Dayan Center, and one of them is our esteemed colleague, Eyal Zissa, was unfortunately not here, but he wrote just 6 days before 7 October, he wrote, Hamas is not deterred and is willing to play with fire. The next round of conflict on the Strip's border is thus a matter of time. Now, this is an example of someone who only follows OSINT as opposed to the, intelligence organizations. And he could see that something might be happening. So I'm going to just say these 2 things, and I'm handing over back to you. If you read the full paper, which I hope you will, there is a great deal of similarity between what we saw in 73 and 23, this overconfidence, this idea that the enemy is deterred, this selective use of sources. And the second thing is that we see that OSINT remains a valuable tool to understand reality, to understand what is happening, and we definitely should keep it in our toolbox. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much. Next is Professor Amos Nadan, the director of the Dayan Center. and he's going to speak about OSINT September 2023 to today. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I'll start by just giving a few words about the Dayan Center, whom I'm sure that the majority are familiar with. Basically, we are academic research center. We are located at Tel Aviv University. We are referred often as a think tank, but what is important to mention is that we are not think tank that prescribe policies. Rather, we are think tank that assist different people to know more about the Middle East. Basically, we conduct research. We have around 50 researchers, and the vast majority of us are with PhD in history and social sciences. And what our researchers are expected to do is basically connect between the experience that they have or things that they learned in the past to current affairs as well. So to take our knowledge from the past and to connect it to the present. This is, in fact, what we ask the people to do. All of them publish in all these Q1, Q, whatever journals, but we also publish for the general public. We engage frequently with the media, and we are also open to consultation, which is basically with Israeli kind of government or governmental agencies, with other countries. We're greatly involved in these activities, and in fact, it's non-official, it's not for citation under the Chatham House rule and sometimes more extreme. And our aim is, one, to make academic knowledge accessible. Now, after October 7th, we expanded our activity. So we expanded the number of researchers. We aim to have more. And we have a forum for regional cooperation that, in fact, you are invited to be in touch and maybe to join institutions are joining. We have institutions specifically from the Middle East, from the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and more, that are part of that cooperation, which is, in fact, making academic research together. Now, besides, we have several activities like Track 2, Track 1.5 activities, which, in fact, people like those from the Forum for Regional Cooperation are taking part of. Okay. So this year, or every year, we have seminar for the researcher, and this year, or last year, the seminar was October 7 on the timeline, History and Contemporary History. And what we realized during that discussions, that in fact, much of the OSINT, some of the discussions were with people from different agencies, that much of the OSINT, the open source kind of material, was not, in fact, read, taken seriously, and in fact was ignored, and the preference was to conceptions linked with specific kind of very secret intelligence, which in fact was in many cases wrong. So the book that Jonathan just mentioned is something that is going to be published soon in Hebrew, and after that, I believe that it will publish also in English. And what I'll do now, I'll mention several essays from that book, or the main conclusions in that essays, that the presenter are not here, or one of them is here, which is me. And I'll tell you what I did about, what I wrote about, and then very quickly, and then about the rest. So basically, I'm in my background an economic historian, and what I did is I looked at the case of economic sanction, which me and other people wrote about many times, that basically they do not work, either the negative or the positive, and you can see that in the Arab world. Negative, making sure that you suffer; positive, giving you money. And Israel continues to ignore that, And usually people, when I used to speak with people also, in several occasions from the government, they said to me, you don't understand. In this specific case, it will work. And there were two cases that it definitely worked for Israel. Of course, didn't. Iran and Hamas. So with Hamas, it started by giving money, by constraining Hamas activities, saying, okay, we'll not enter people to come into Israel to work, and so on and so forth. And later on, it was by giving money to Hamas. And in both cases, when you created suffer in the Palestinian Authority and problem in workplaces, the people went to work with Hamas. And when you gave money to Hamas, the money went specifically to terror. So it didn't work anyway. The economic activities that Israel did in order to change or to moderate the activity of Hamas, to make the less violence, didn't work. This takes me to another chapter by Michael Milton he wrote about the conception and crisis, and what he showed there, which is connected to what I've mentioned about my paper, is about how Israelis were sure in different places that money would make Hamas with Israel or make what Israel want to achieve, which is a totally Western-style attitude, believing that jihad or other activities are unrelated to Hamas. Michael Milton is an expert on Hamas history, and he shows that things continue and even becoming more harsher in statesman websites, different publications, and so on. And this takes me to another paper by Sagi Polka. Everyone is doctor or above. Sagi Polka wrote about listening to Sinwar word, and what he did, he got all the expressions, all the statements of Sinwar. Some were mentioned here by Jonathan, and in fact, he analyzed also them and connected them to Quranic knowledge, to Islam, statement from the Islam. And what he presents very clearly is that whoever familiar with, Islamic tradition, with the Quran and so on, can see that there is attack on as a target, like all the expressions that were given in these kind of statement by Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas at that time, were in fact aiming at war. We are going to attack Israel, and things that relate to Quran, to Quranic stories, and so on. So you relate that to that area. Brandon Friedman, the head of research at the Dayan Center, basically what he did, he analyzed the geopolitical puzzle between Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. And one of the arguments that he explored is that, in fact, Iran had a kind of so-called agreement or attempt to have an agreement with Iran and Saudi Arabia, and also there were discussions between Israel and Saudi Arabia following that. And what he presents is that basically the Iran pushed forward, pressed on the proxies activities, in fact, by knowing that Israel is having a kind of good relations or better relations with Saudi. And what he suggests here that if you understand, of course, the country is like, or the case of Polka, if you understand the culture, whatever, you can better understand the situation. May I put just a note? From our discussion with people that deal with the analysis, you can see that in many cases they are brilliant guys, but about 20 years old or something like that. So they don't have the background, and in many cases, it is not connected to something more academic, deeper, with more understanding. Okay. Eyal Zisser wrote about Israel, Hezbollah, and the misread map. And basically what he stressed is that Israel misunderstood Hezbollah and Hezbollah misunderstood Israel, and he elaborated how these misconceptions, in fact, could be seen via the OSINT. Chelsea Mueller did the same about the Houthis and said that Israel ignored their activity as proxy, as unconnected to Iran, and misunderstood what proxy mean. And she calls it like proxy is not a puppet. And that was the different activity. Last but not least, Michael Barak, all, of course, from Dayan Center, wrote about anti-Semitism in open sources, and he followed the National Student for Justice in Palestine, a kind of network for pro-Hamas network in the US and other places, and he showed how, in fact, Hamas operated significant activities, anti-Israeli activities that, in fact, was known by the OSINT, but Israel, and in fact also the US, was not really alerted by these activities in the campus. Thank you.
Okay. Next is Dr. Tom Sharon, postdoctoral research at the Dayan Center. Today's title is The Israeli 9/11, Arab Media Discourse on October 7th and September 11th Terror Attacks, a comparative analysis. Thank you, Dr. Sharon.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Today, I'd like to talk about the crucial role of Arab media as a tool of understanding the changing reality in our region. I'll do so through a comparative analysis of Arab media narratives surrounding two milestones in the history of the clash between the West and jihadi movements: Al-Qaeda terror attacks on US soil on September 11th, and Hamas brutal attack on Israel on October 7, 2023. Both events received extensive coverage in global media, and particularly in Arab media, across a wide spectrum of angles and perspectives. Yet, before that, it is important to recognize why the media sphere itself is such a vital field of study. Because of its profound role in shaping regional and global political processes and the immense influence it exerts upon them. The media's crucial role in the region stems from the fact that it is relevant to nearly all key factors and actors in the Middle East. First, to the region's leaders, who in recent years have undergone a deep learning process regarding new media, turning it into an instrument of power and a vehicle for advancing their own visions. Second, to the Arab street, the region's people, who have transformed to the new journalists, as we call them, and the content creators in our digital era, and active agents and storytellers shaping the very reality they report on. Third, the global jihadist movements and terror organizations, which often view media not merely as a tool of propaganda or recruitment, but as a pure means for their own presence. Half of jihad is media, as it's written here on left. And finally, to the expanding technological and digital platforms that continue to transform the accessibility, the way we consume content and information. So when we engage in an in-depth study of discourse, we must be mindful of this potential impact on the nature of meaning of the narratives we analyze. In the research I will discuss today, our focus is deliberately placed on mainstream outlets that are among the most watched, read, and followed across the Arab world. This focus allows us a clear understanding of dominant attitudes and sentiments in Arab public opinion regarding key political and ideological issues, distinct from the social media sphere, where discourse operates under different and more complex methodological conditions, like Harel will talk about later. When we seek to outline in broad and comparative terms the nature of the discourse surrounding 9/11 and October 7, we can identify a remarkably wide range of rhetorical tools and polemic strategies employed in Arab media. They range from expressions of empathy, joy, and solidarity with the terrorists to condemnation and outrage rejection of their acts. This tree of narratives, as you can see, that emerges from this analysis is vast, but it is rooted primarily in several themes considered taboo within Arab media discourse, such as the link between Islam and terrorism, and the ongoing unresolved debate over the true path of Islam. From a comparative perspective, we can detect strictly similar narratives in both cases. In each, leading Arab journalists, mostly from Qatari or pro-Qatari outlets, carefully collaborated narrative that at best barely condemned the attacks while simultaneously expressing a form of satisfaction from the strike that hit the United States and Israel in both cases, portraying them as having brought them upon themselves through their long policies and actions in the Middle East. Both media discourses also emphasize the simplicity of the operations. Knives and threats for hijacking planes on September 11th and the breach of Israeli sophisticated defenses on October 7th, each used rhetorically to highlight the humiliation of powerful nations whose technological and intelligence superiority was suddenly rendered meaningless. Within this broader context, we found numerous and often striking expressions of admiration for the masterminds behind these horrific terror attacks and the leaders of these organizations that carry them out. Osama bin Laden, for instance, was described by some Arab journalists as a jihadist rock star, a revolutionary who willingly chose hardship over comfort, driven by ideological conviction that dated back to his struggle against the Soviets in Afghanistan. And similarly, Yahya Sinwar, the head leader of Hamas in Gaza, and Mohammad Def, the high commander of its Al-Qassam brigades, were portrayed by leading Arab journalists as figures who left behind a glorious legacy that humiliated Israeli and Western intelligence alike, a legacy that, in their words, would continue to serve as a model for future generations. On the other side of the spectrum, both case studies also reveal voices of criticism, condemnation within Arab media discourse. Most of them are in Egyptian and Saudi leading outlets, with their interest of keeping the alliances with the United States and fighting terrorism. Following the September 11 attacks, many journalists expressed frustration over the damage caused to the image of Islam and Muslims, as well as concern about possible American retaliation against the Arab and Muslim worlds. And after October 7, particularly in recent months, we have seen a growing trend of criticism directed at Hamas and the negative consequences of its actions for Palestinians in general and the residents of Gaza in particular. Much of this criticism, especially in, as I said, Saudi and Egyptian media, aims not only to denounce Hamas, but also to undermine the momentum of political Islam movement in the Arab world, the ideological current that produced Hamas and continues to enjoy broad grassroots support today. The continuity of this critical narrative can be traced through a series of opinion articles published in leading Arab newspapers over the past 2 decades, all covering a similar message of frustration with a media environment that provides a sympathetic platform for terrorism. For instance, after September 11, journalist Hazem Saria wrote about the Arabs' moral responsibility for the attacks. 13 years later, Hashem Saleh wrote at Asharq al-Awsat, argued that the joy expressed in parts of the Arab world over 9/11 paved the way for the rise of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And a decade after that, Tariq al-Hamid wrote also in Sharq al-Awsat that Arab sympathy for Hamas actions on October 7th revealed that little had been learned from 9/11 and its devastating consequences for the region. At the center of the ongoing debate over media responsibility, stands the Qatari network you all know, Al Jazeera, long considered both the CNN of the Arab world and the Arab world's #1 media outlet. From its early years in the 1990s, the network was accused of prompting jihadi narratives and offering a sympathetic platform to political and radical Islam movements. In its early broadcasts, for example, Al Jazeera dedicated primetime hours to the popular show Ash-Shari'atu al-Hayat, hosted by Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi here at the center, often described as the cleric who provided the religious justification for the 9/11 attacks. In her book on 2011 US Navy SEALs raid on bin Laden's compound in Abbottabad, journalist Nelly Lahoud revealed that Al Jazeera producers and senior correspondents had maintained direct contact with the Al-Qaeda leader to coordinate delivery of his message and producing programs about him. And above all, Al Jazeera has consistently adopted an uncompromisingly favorable line towards the Palestinian issue in general and towards so-called resistance movements, especially Hamas. So I'll jump for the conclusion and go back to this slide. This comparative analysis of these two case studies underscores the importance of Arab media discourse analysis as an integral part of Middle Eastern studies. The role of media in the Arab world is evolving and gaining increasing significance over time, especially in light of technological advances and the global digital revolution. Media outlets have become more deeply involved in and influential upon political processes and regional transformations. This reality calls for a distinct research discipline, one capable of unpacking the complex interplay between media, politics, ideology, and society in the Arab world. Thank you very much.
Next up is Dr. Ido Yahel, also at the Moshe Dayan Center, specializing in Syria. His title is Known but Unforeseen, OSINT Failure and the Collapse of the Assad Regime. Thank you, Dr. Yahel.
Hi, hello everyone. So when Jonathan asked me to write about this topic, I was happy because it was a good methodological exercise to analyze my own failure. So I'm happy to present my own failure right here. So let's start by looking at the map of Syria just 1 year. Now it's okay? Yeah, Tom is much higher than me. Then, so this is Syria just before, 1 year before the start of the HTS coup. So basically, the pink area was the area the Assad regime controlled, the yellow one, the Kurds, the green one, the Turks via their proxy, the Syrian National Army, the SNA, and the little white part in the northwest was controlled by the HTS, the Salvation government, and pretty much no scholar, no researcher thought that a year from now, from then, this white area will control the majority of the territory and become the new power ruler in Damascus. So let's start. So yeah, it caught very much everyone off guard, but as we are going to see, open source intelligence provide a lot of data that suggested that the regime is very weak and that this thing is in the cards. So it's not, it shouldn't have been come out of the blue. So let's start by the assumptions, or maybe the conception word that everyone like to use. So pretty much every Syrian scholar looked at the Battle of Aleppo, December 2016, and the victory of the Assad regime, but truly it was Hezbollah, which won the Aleppo in December 2016 as the watershed moment of the Syrian civil war. Since then, everyone agreed that Assad is winning, and it's just a matter of time before the war will be over, and Assad will be able to consolidate his rule over the entire country. There were other indicators, so the Astana process, which also involved Turkey and Iran. And in 2023, Syria was readmitted to the Arab League with the support of every Arab nation outside of Qatar. Qatar abstained, but the entire Arab League outside of Qatar voted in favor. So the common belief was that the regime maybe is not very, very strong, but is resilient, and his allies are strong, and is durable. Now let's move to trashing myself. So in October 2024, I wrote in August 2024 an article that was supposed to come out in October 2024 about why Assad does not join the Shiite Axis war against Israel. If you remember the context in August, before Israel and Hezbollah waged their war, the entire Axis attacked Israel, right? Hezbollah did it on a daily basis, also the Iraqi militias, and the Houthis did it on almost a daily basis, and even Iran joined the party in April, launched several hundred missiles and drones to southern Israel. But Assad didn't. Assad refused. So I gave several explanations, and if you change the headline from why Assad does not join the war against Israel and why the Assad regime collapsed, you can see these explanations are valid, right? The regime the infrastructure was very weak, almost non-existent in most of the country. There were protests in the southern Syria, mostly in the Druze area, 2 years of protest. Assad was very wary about this protest. He appointed to be for the government of the governor of Sueda was the governor of Aleppo. Won the Aleppo rebellion for him. He was very worried about it. Economic data, there was inflation and poverty, and all other things he said about sanctions, the Caesar Act, right? Also the earthquake, if you remember, February 2023, a very destructive earthquake, Syria and Turkey. And another thing, ISIS, ever since ISIS lost its territorial caliphate in 2018, there was a gradual decrease in its attack in Syria. Pretty much every year there were less attacks of ISIS. But in 2024, the trend changed, and there were more attacks in 2024 compared to 2023. So ISIS was also able to lift its head and carry out attacks, and HTS as well. I wrote in this article that HTS is a growing challenge to Assad authority because it was able to kill a lot of Assad soldiers at the time. So this was my article, which never saw light of day, fortunately for me. And I think one of the things, the bottom line is one of the simplistic explanation, because the HTS attack started the day Israel and the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah went into effect. So everyone connect between these events. It was obvious, maybe it was the trigger, but there are a lot of open source information that documented the regime vulnerability even way before Israel started the attacks against Hezbollah leadership. So, what we missed, what OSINT didn't see, and again, trashing myself. So when the war started and HTS already occupied Homs and Aleppo, I was asked what's going to happen next. I thought that, okay, these are mainly Sunni areas, but in Latakia, the Alawite stronghold, there is going to be a fierce battle, a battle to the death. I think one of the things OSINT didn't know and was unable to document is, first of all, how weak Assad army is and how very much inconsistent the Alawite community is. We've always thought that the Alawite community will always fight for Assad, but it took 48 hours between the first entrance of HTS warriors to Latakia until Assad was already gone. So we didn't understand how the Alawite community will not be able to fight, will not be willing to fight to the death for Assad. So at the end, let's wrap up. So first of all, there is confirmation bias. Since 2017, the conventional wisdom is that the Assad regime won, that the Assad regime is durable, and we ignored all the signs that suggest otherwise. We pretty much rely on territorial control. Let's go back to the map. We saw this map and we thought this is it. Assad is gaining more and more control, more and more territory. It means that he is more powerful. Maybe this is not the situation. We need to look beside us. And for myself, I think we are underweighting a lot of data, like social, economic data, especially within certain communities. In the morning, I was in a discussion about the minorities. I think when we now try to analyze the current situation of the Ashar regime, people always look at the Druze, look at the Kurds, look at the Sunnis, and how they treat this regime as well, not just the minorities. And as I said, the problem was not the lack of information. The information was there. The problem was interpretation. And so this was on me. So I hope I will learn in the future how to interpret information better.
Thank you much, Dr. Yahel. Next is Dr. Joel Parker, who's a researcher at the Dayan Center. His topic is how Trump's choice to engage Syria, Abu Jalani, surprised many Israeli OSINT analysts. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to follow. How do I change this? Okay. So anyway, I'm actually following along in the timeline after Ido mentioned that a lot of us were shocked. Most analysts were shocked, really, by the overthrow of Assad. I mean, if you look at the Swedish researcher Michael Lund, I think his name is Michael Lund. Anyway, he was admitted it. We were all kind of seeing that the front lines were static. But what happened after that is kind of interesting, and I want to talk about how mostly Israeli-based OSINT accounts on Twitter, X, if you will, were following the events as they were happening, and what I would say that they were often surprised over and over again at what was happening after the Assad regime collapsed and the takeover of this HTS leader Muhammad Abu Julani, who now we all know as Ahmad al-Shara, comes to power, and suddenly he cuts his beard a little bit shorter, puts on a suit, a tie, and this guy is in power. And I think for a lot of OSINT and analysts based in Israel mostly, it was certainly a surprise, but there was a lot of skepticism, and not just in the OSINT intelligence gathering world, but I think throughout various conversations I had, and I've cheated a little bit by talking to people who were not in just OSINT. I'm not in any other organization, but I spoke to people who worked for other organizations that knew more than me about things going on, and they were also kind of basically scratching their heads going, I don't know what's happening here. And there's a lot of question as to who was supporting things, what was going on here. Now we know also from open source information that there were feelers going out from Western, governments to try and figure out what was actually happening in Idlib. You can go on YouTube and watch an interesting video by the former ambassador, Robert Ford, who talks about going with an NGO to Idlib in 2023 and having conversations with Ahmad al-Shara and kind of like feeling him out to figure out who is this guy for real, and he came back with the conclusion that Ahmad al-Shara was a legitimate leader who wanted to bring about legitimate change to Syria, and I think that was, you can see from open source information that there was a lot going on behind the scenes, so to speak. Of course, we don't know everything from open sources, but still, even especially if you're willing to be patient and wait till after the fact a little bit, clues can come out showing you that what was happening behind the scenes. Oh, where did I go here? Okay, so one of the first things that came out initially, though, from the Israeli kind of intelligence world was this idea that maybe, Ahmad al-Shara, he's here for now, but he won't be around for very long. So there was two kind of directions that I called wishful thinking. They were kind of policy recommendations that I saw in the open source world. One was that let's weaken Syria. Let's make sure that Syria stays kind of weak and cannot become a threat to Israel. And that was kind of one suggestion out there. Another suggestion out there was, well, let's just go ahead and divide Syria up into a bunch of countries. And there were certain pull factors coming from inside Syria. Certain groups were very much on board with this idea. In fact, there were certain groups contacting Israel saying, hey, would you support a breakaway state in Latakia? Would you support a breakaway state in Rojava? Would you support the Druze breaking away? And Israeli officials were getting these signals from inside Syria that, hey, we would like to just have our own separate country right now. And I think that there was a lot of confusion within the Israeli policy world. In fact, just looking at, like, for instance, statements from the Israeli Foreign Ministry and statements from the Minister of Defense, things were very unclear what Israel wants to happen. So what you saw in the OSINT intelligence world was a lot of kind of mixture of what I call wishful thinking, like, hey, let's see what would happen. How do people react to this policy? And throwing out ideas to see what kind of reaction they would get on the internet. And also, I think it did cloud their analysis a bit because there were so many kind of ideas going on at the time in early, like, say, January, February, March of 2025. This year, there were a lot of ideas floating around, but almost nobody said, well, what if Ahmed al-Shara is just a good leader and manages to get Syria on track to development? Like, nobody thought that. That just wasn't even like, that wasn't sort of a thing that people thought. So there were a lot of other ideas going on, and people, of course, criticized this idea. Syrians, many Syrians who have been fighting for over a decade, or some of them their whole lives, to see a democratic change, and not just democratic change, I shouldn't use that word, maybe stability and openness in Syria. We're kind of like, no, this is not the time to divide up Syria. This is not the time at all to try and, go back to civil war or chaos or insanity. Let's try and put this country back together again. And interestingly, I think that some of the OSINT people started realizing that actually, the regional powers that be, so to speak, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, UAE, were all kind of like saying, hey, let's try and keep Syria together and let's not break Syria apart. So in May, what happened was, as you all know, on the 13th of May, Donald Trump met with Ahmed al-Shara in Saudi Arabia, and that dramatically changed the situation, because suddenly we went from this Ahmed al-Shara guy being maybe okay, maybe not okay, to suddenly Trump reaching out his hand and shaking his hand. And that was like, I think for a lot of OSINT intelligence people online, that was such a shock. But soon after that, you saw people, this guy, I quote this guy, Open Source Intel, he's based in Israel. I have no idea who he is. I chose him specifically because I don't know him. I mean, I know people who say things, and I don't like to put them out there because I don't know if they want to be quoted. But this guy, I don't know who he is. Anyway, he's often like following along with like kind of trying to piece together what Israeli policy might be or should be or ought to be with what is actually happening. And I feel like that was kind of, it was a little bit of, I think just watching these accounts, I was getting like whiplash. Like one day they're like, Abu Julani is this terrorist. The next day they're like, no, he's actually pretty cool. And then you're like, what happened in between? Oh yeah, he's best friends with Trump now. Okay, that's nice. So we have this kind of like thing going on, but then there was a lot of, soon after there was actually, it looked like Netanyahu and al-Shara were maybe going to meet up at the UN, maybe going to sign some big security agreement. It looked like things were on track, and Trump and his team and the administration was organizing, Israel and Syria need to get like their policy worked out together. And suddenly violence broke out in July in the Sueda region, which is the Druze majority town. And it went all the way to where one of the ministers in the cabinet, who's not actually foreign minister or anything, just this guy Chikli, who's, he's kind of a bit of a firebrand, to put it mildly, said, hey, why don't we should be actually trying to kill Ahmed al-Shara. And to be honest, that was a threat that was kind of seen as a shot across the bow. Of course, Israel literally did actually destroy the Defense Department building in Damascus in these events where Israel felt like the Syrians had kind of gone crazy. And there was certainly violence, and I'm not going to downplay the violence. I don't want to downplay real violence, but things kind of blew up. And so, then the open source is sort of trying to run to follow what Israel is looking at here and saying, okay, yeah, actually, never mind. Ahmed al-Shara is a bad guy. And of course, they're going back to calling him Jolani, which is another thing that's kind of funny. Like when the Israeli intelligence people like him, he's al-Shara. When they don't, he's al-Jolani. So it's kind of this funny like back and forth. You see even in August, like when you see other countries starting to embrace Ahmed al-Shara and saying, hey, listen, I don't know if he's going towards democracy, but in any case, we have an address, we have a guy, and Trump likes him, the Saudis like him, the Turks like him, a lot of Syrians seem to like him. Let's work with him because everybody knows that Syria going back to, the war is going to be a problem. But the Israeli intelligence guys are kind of like still confused. Like, is he a terrorist? Is he not a terrorist? So it's just kind of this bit of confusion. What I would say, and like kind of to conclude, is that the discourse on inside Israel on the situation in Syria has been very interesting to follow. You have journalists Roy Kais is a journalist. I quoted him in Hebrew just because I wanted you to see up on the right, like that's the original, and on the left, often, so be careful if you don't speak Hebrew, like when you go to Grok and you push translate, it sometimes translates when Israelis write President al-Shara, it translates it as President al-Assad, which is obviously not true. But what you see in the conversation in Israel, obviously, if you don't read Hebrew, it doesn't matter. It's just the idea being here that Israeli OSINT is trying to follow what's happening, and the big curveball, I think, has been the fact that Trump, I think, sees the big picture and sees kind of the regional powers saying, hey, let's give Syria a chance. And that's, I'm concluding now, I'm out of time, but that's the idea. I think that the Israeli OSINT went from, at the beginning of the year, going, Syria's done. How do we divide it up? To now trying to figure out how to justify ex post facto this amazing change that's happened in this past year. And I just wanted to share that. We can ask questions and keep that going.
Thank you very much, Dr. Parker. And finally on the panel, not least, but finally, is Dr. Harel Chorev. And his talk, he's also at the Dayan Center, and his title is Israel and the Jewish People are Fighting Without an Air Force, the Failure to Act on Social Media. Thank you so much. So, and after this, we're going to go straight to the audience for questions, okay?
Thank you, Michael. Well, I want to speak about something which is very important for me for many years already, both as a researcher, which is doing it as a sort of a hobby, and as an Israeli patriot, I must say, and as a practitioner. And this is the situation of Israel in the online arena, if you'd like, the online theater. For many years, the so-called delegitimization war and the fact that Israel is not doing anything about it. And trust me, if I chose anything, I mean anything. First, let me start with something that might moderate what I've just argued, but it is important to mention it. The situation of Israel in that sphere is not derived only because of its capability or incapability to bring its narrative forward. It's not. To my view, it's because that Israel falls between wider phenomena that affects all over, the world, Western society, and the U.S. in particular. And I'm talking about polarization between, the two major parties, but also ideologies that have underwent a weaponization, talking about settler colonialism theory, talking about intersectionalism, and many other theories which are basically ideologies. They're not really theories, as Adam Kirsch nicely put it. Israel finds itself there as a benchmark, not necessarily because of what is going on with the conflict. And this is one thing that we need to remember. It's not only about how we're going to bring forward our narrative. Secondly, as my small talk title is arguing, I think that we cannot let go the fact that we are fighting without a strategic arm, exactly like an air force, and we're not doing anything. It's not something new. It's not something typical just for this current government, but rather to all the government. And I can tell you, as the former advisor on Palestinian affairs of the Knesset Foreign and Security Affairs during the Bennett-Lapid government, that I called once, I think it was during one of the rounds, I called one of my friend, a Knesset member, and I told her, listen, if the information sphere was the physical sphere, we would have been occupied long time ago. We are not doing anything. And she said, oh, we're so bad, we're so worse. Did they do anything? Nothing at all. But it's a prolonging issue, it's a prolonging policy, and really I can't really understand it. And now, to my view, it's this crisis derives out of two major arguments, or I would say tendencies, which we can identify with both sides of the map. In the right, very often people are saying, they're numerous, our enemies are numerous, there's no point to fight them even. There are billions and billions, as if you know, in the modern arena, people are fighting, face to face. It doesn't work like this. On the other hand, if you go to the left side, they're saying, yes, but we have a problem. Once we will resolve the conflict, everything will be resolved, which is also a very naive way in understanding it, not to mention the fact that many of our enemies and rivals at the moment are not speaking about any resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a solution which doesn't include the total abolishment of the State of Israel. Having that said, I must say that it's connected also to the situation of the diaspora Jewry. And in this as well, I was highly involved just a few years ago when I was called to one of the prominent Jewish leaders here in the United States to offer a solution to the rising anti-Semitism online. So I came with a solution which was very, very sophisticated. I will say a word about it very soon. But what I found very soon is that neither he or his companion were serious. And I must say it with a lot of sadness. Fragmented leadership, interested mainly in the credit, or you know what, let me put it in the way that a very official Qatari, a very senior Qatari official put it to one of my friends. He said, the problem with the leaders here, the Jewish leaders here, that they are interested in putting their name on those faculties. They're not interested in what's going on inside. We are interested in what's going inside. We, the Qatari, namely. Or in other words, they are buying the hardware, we are buying the software. And this is, I think, really summarized the whole thing. And unfortunately, they didn't do anything. They got a great solution. They didn't do anything. Everything just went to the drain because of prestige and ego issues. Unfortunately, I'm really sorry to say that, but it was very disappointing. And I think, communities here paid the price for it and are still paying. Now, regarding the solution, what can be done about it? First of all, such campaigns that are based online we can assimilate them to a plague. They start like this, and all of a sudden they go up exponentially. This is how it works. Your only chance to prevent it is to catch it while it's still there, like in the first, cline of the and otherwise it's like a wildfire. The way to do this is to build a state, massive system, sophisticated one, of hundreds of workers, and technological means in a military level, of machine learning, okay? Machine learning that can understand what is going on and alert about it. And of course, AI, artificial intelligence, in order to monitor sentiment, trends, and campaigns. Campaigns, again, works like this. The solution, and obviously experience will improve our ability to deal with that, should be multidimensional. It's not just a warfare online. It's a warfare that uses multidimensional networks, or complexity, if you'd like it in a professional language. It means to deal with the situation on TikTok, Instagram, and so on and so forth, but also to combine operations in the institutional media and even on the field itself. And that is in order to create an effect that works. It's possible. Israel and other countries are doing it very well in a tactical spectrum. Other countries are doing it, like Russia and China are doing it, unfortunately and successfully, on a wider scale, but it's totally possible, and it requires Israel's proactive approach first and foremost. Thank you very much.